doesn't want these workers who are risking their lives working second and third shifts to have to go to a union rep after work to give them their check. The backlash that he's received about that has been just incredible.
Are you on? Which side are you on?
Let's shift gears then and talk about some of the political situation in Florida. I think DeSantis is more or less a household name at this point. And one of the things that he is doing is attacking unions in Florida. What are some of the ways that he's attacking labor down there?
So, I mean, one of his number one, I shouldn't say his number one enemy, but a big enemy of DeSantis is the teachers' unions. He's waged the war on the teachers' unions. They all went behind his opponent, Charlie Crist, last year. Charlie Crist's running mate was a teachers' union president herself. But in January of this year, DeSantis unveiled this so-called Teachers' Bill of Rights that was just a blatant attack on teachers' unions. And then within a couple months, Republican lawmakers introduced legislation that doesn't just target teachers' unions, it targets public sector unions at large, with the exception of unions representing firefighters, cops, correction staff, and probation officers, which should be mentioned. This is the unions that traditionally endorse and give a lot of campaign cash to Republicans, including the bill sponsor of the Senate bill, which is advancing the fastest. That bill sponsor alone has received at least $15,000 from police unions since 2020. I did a little bit digging the other day. But so this legislation, I should mention, it's been introduced, similar iterations have been introduced since 2011 when Matt Gaetz was bringing forth that legislation. And so what this legislation specifically would do would place a ban on automatic dues deduction, and similar but even worse than last year's version, the bill would impose a 60% membership threshold, where in Florida, teachers' unions are already required to meet a 50% threshold under a bill signed into law in 2018. But everybody I've spoken to, has said it's hard to reach a 60% threshold in a right-to-work state. And there are unions that have reached and surpassed the 60% threshold, but there has been just a wave of opposition to this legislation. The only support for it is the only open support, I should say, is coming from representatives of conservative think tanks. So. Right.
Of course. And that and all of these bills anywhere, bills like this have not only historically been introduced in Florida, but they have been historically and contemporaneously introduced all across the country by, right-wing anti-labor freaks. And they always do basically the same thing. And they always have an exception for cops. And that really goes to show that this is not about individual freedom. It's not about individual liberty or an individual Bill of Rights. It is simply and totally naked power grabbing. Rewarding.
I should say,
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I should say, he's been pushed on that too, as far as the exemption. That was one of the first questions I asked him, because he argues, the Senate bill sponsor, that is, argues it's a pro-union piece of legislation because it will force union bosses to have more face-to-face conversations with their union members or workers to maintain or reach that threshold, and to have more conversations when if there's a ban on dues deduction. He keeps bringing up this thing about how, I guess I should say, his explanation for why he is exempting the cops, the firefighters, the correction staff is they are a, quote, special class of workers who work long hours, sometimes second and third shifts, And repeatedly, he's mentioned he doesn't want these workers who are risking their lives working second and third shifts to have to go to a union rep after work to give them their check. And the backlash that he's received about that has been just incredible. Before he was even asked by lawmakers in committee stops, I talked to a few union members, specifically teachers and faculty members on the phone, and I repeated that explanation to them because the first time I reached out to the Senate bill sponsor, he emailed me back. He hasn't since, but I read that to them, and there's a lot of workers in the public sector that are working very long hours. Particularly, one example that I hadn't really thought of before people were starting to bring it up is resident physicians and nurses at public hospitals in the state of Florida, some of whom are working upwards of 80 hours a week, and they depend on their union. But especially the resident physicians, they've brought up that because of how residency works, it would be pretty much impossible for them to reach and maintain that 60% threshold because of the turnover in their union. So they would risk decertification, and as a result, they would lose their union contract if that decertification went into effect. Right.
Yeah, it's just totally a naked power grab, rewarding political allies and trying to hurt political enemies, and it's really gross. But you mentioned in your piece that was published just yesterday, Florida's anti-union bill could risk over $500 million in federal funds. So talk to us. There's this, obviously the anti-union piece of it, despite, the insistence that it's pro-union, obviously the impact on unions would be negative. But there's also there's an interesting fiscal component to the effects of this bill. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so before I even get to the big one, a Senate bill analysis for the Senate version estimates that just the recertification process for unions that fall below 60% would cost the state an estimated over $900,000. So there's that, which is known. But the thing that I've been trying to report on a little bit more over the past week, which I'm honestly surprised has not been reported on before, as far as I know, especially because similar legislation has been proposed in for the past decade, and maybe in older years there was some reporting on it, but I haven't been able to find it, is a claim by, it came from the Amalgamated Transit Union first, which represents about 6,000 transit workers in the state of Florida. And they've been emailing lawmakers and bringing up, they've also emailed the Department of Labor about this as well to confirm or just to see if this is true. But they say that if this bill passed, because of they say that if this bill would pass, it would risk over $500 million in federal transit funds for the state of Florida in this year alone, in the next year, because of employee protections under the Federal Transit Act. And that includes the preservation of rights and benefits of employees under existing collective bargaining agreements, the continuation of collective bargaining rights, the protection of individual employees against a worsening of their positions in relation to their employment. So the union argues that the ban on dues deduction, for instance, would infringe upon their right to bargain for that. And if the unions were decertified, then they argue that that would also violate the protections within the Federal Transit Act. And so because of all the money flowing in from the Biden infrastructure bill, the unions say that could be at risk for the state of Florida. And I know even where I am in Orlando, that's $43 million in this year alone. But
wow.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure I broke the story on that last week, I think. But it's starting to make the rounds. And there was actually a Republican lawmaker on Thursday who finally brought it up with the bill sponsor, and he denied it. Then when he was pushed on it further, he said that he would double check to make sure. He argued that under the law, workers don't have to be protected by, a collective bargaining agreement. It can be just any sort of protective agreement. And I'm not sure that's true. He brought up, there are public transit workers in other states that have outright, banned collective bargaining rights for public sector workers. There are transit workers there that the systems do get funding. But so I still honestly, like, to be fully transparent, I'm not entirely sure if that would happen, if all of that money would be entirely at risk. But it seems, based on communications I've read between the union, the ATU, and the DOL, and what I've heard from various people within the ATU that I've talked to, it seems like the claim, the risk of losing all that money does have merit.
Interesting. Yeah, that's definitely, that's a fascinating point in that story. Are there any other anti-union bills that are coming from the Florida's legislature or being proposed by the governor?
I mean, that's the most explicitly anti-union, but there's also a few other bills that affect labor. For instance, there's a bill, probably the next most closely linked is HB 917. It's called vaguely state minimum wage, but essentially what it would do is carve out minor league players from Florida's minimum wage, which is currently $11 per hour. And there's a reporter, Jason Garcia, who's been doing a lot of good reporting on that. But the sad thing too is that bill is actually advancing as well, which is just incredible to think about, that you would do something like that when there are already a lot of minor leaguers that have reported poverty wage conditions.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really wild. And Florida is a state without a Department of Labor, I learned from your piece, because there's legislation to try to reestablish a state Department of Labor after it was dismantled by Governor Jeb Bush.
Yeah, so I learned about that last year. I'm pretty sure it was last year when I was doing some reporting on wage theft, because the State Department of Labor used to investigate those things. But because Florida no longer has a State Department of Labor, there is some sort of like economic agency. Wage theft is just incredibly widespread, and there's little to no enforcement because that goes through the Florida Attorney General, who, as far as a couple of policy experts I've talked to, they say that they don't really enforce it. And then the other option is to go to the federal government. But the federal government, the DOL, can only enforce the federal minimum wage, which is a lot lower than Florida's. So that's a huge issue. But yeah, so there's been a legislation the past couple of years by, I think, the same couple people. There's actually a local Senator, Victor Torres, who's a current dues-paying union member, who has proposed legislation over the past couple of years to reestablish a State Department of Labor. And there's also a House equivalent as well. But of course, that legislation is languishing because we don't need anything like that. We don't need wage theft enforcement or minimum wage enforcement at all.
Of course, of course. McKenna Schueler, reporter for the Orlando Weekly, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Is there anything else that folks ought to know about? And if not, where's the best place for folks to find you?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of bad bills this session targeting public education, faculty, a lot of anti-queer, anti-trans bills, which intersect with labor rights. I've been trying to do reporting on that, but there's a lot of good reporters in Florida that are trying to keep on this. As far as my reporting, you can find me and my work at orlandoweekly.com, and I'm on Twitter way too often at @SheCarriesOn. So thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm so happy to be here, by the way.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, McKenna. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.